Hello again. So we're going to look at the basic chess endgames, how to checkmate someone using the minor pieces that you're remaining with on the board, either a king, a queen, a rook, a bishop, or a pawn. So we're going to start with the queen. So white is remaining with the queen and the king. Then black just has a king. So you need to find a way to put your opponent's king in a position where it has got no legal moves, then it's checkmated. So white begins. Now it's black to play. Since black is in check, so it's check. The king moves to d7. The queen moves to a6. So the queen, by virtue of moving on a6, it has cut off the mobility of the enemy king to cross over the 6th rank going forward. So the king moves back to e7. You start moving your white king forward closer to your enemy king. Moves to d7. The king moves to d3, e7, e4, d7, e5, e7. Then you bring your queen down to a7, because this king cannot cross over either to d6 or f6, because the king is controlling those two squares. So it moves back to e8. Then you move your king to e6. The king moves to f8. You bring your queen on f7. The queen is protected by the king, and the queen has attacked the enemy king, which is a checkmate. I'll demonstrate it again. The king is on e8, moves to d7. You move your queen on a6, cut off the mobility of your enemy king. It moves on e7. You move your king on e2, move d7, d3, e7, e4, d7, e5, e7. The queen moves to a7. The king moves back to e8, because e7 on a7 the queen checked the king. So it moves to e8. You move your king to e6. The king moves to f8. Then you bring the queen on f7, checkmate. So the other one is the king and the rook against the king. So black has a rook and the king, and white is just remaining with the king. So the quicker way you're going to use to checkmate your enemy king is to cut off the mobility of the king. So you put your rook in the second rank, meaning this king, the white king, won't be able to cross over the second rank. So it will move closer to the f1 square so that it can go and attack the rook, which is on h2. You move your king to f7, trying to put support for your rook so that you can deliver a checkmate. The king moves to g1. You just move your rook on the other edge of the board so that it's not captured. The king moves to f1. You move to e6. Moves to e1. You move to d5, d1, c4, c1, b3, b1. You move your rook to c3. So now the c file has been cut off from the enemy king to cross over, and also the second rank. So the only square the king is remaining with is a1. Then you drop the rook on c1, it's a checkmate. The king can't come here. It can go on b2. It can go on a2. Deliver a checkmate using a rook. Sometimes you can find that you're remaining with a pawn. You're remaining with a pawn and the king against the king. The secret on this position is that you need to put your king in front of the pawn. That way your king will be guarding the squares where your enemy king can come and protect itself from being checkmated. So you move your king on d7. Black moves on e2. White moves on e2. Black moves on e6. Black moves on e3. You move your king on e5. So now, because the rule says two kings can never be together, can never share a square, there's always one square in between the two kings, this king has to go back to e2. Then you move on e4. You keep moving the king further away from your pawn so that you can now give it room to start moving. So the king moves on d2. Then you move your pawn. You just move it one square forward, because sometimes if you move it 2 squares forward, if you don't know how to finish the end game, you might end up making a stalemate. So the king goes back on e2. Then you move 1 square forward, the pawn on e5. The king moves to d2. You move your king. White moves on e1. You move your king on e3. White moves on d1. You move your pawn on e4. King moves on e1. You move your king on f3. White king moves on f1. Then you start moving your pawn. You move it on e3. The white king moves on e1. So you move your pawn on e2. Now the pawn is controlling the d1 and the f1 square. So the only square the king can go to, the white king can go to, is d2. After moving d2, you need to move closer to the square where you're going to promote your piece. Otherwise, if you just push the pawn and promote, it's going to be captured. So you need to move closer. The king moves either c1 or d3. Then you promote the piece.